me, right? Is it Technics or is it Techniques? I'm sure you will let me know in the comment section below, because today we are going to look at some streaming active loudspeakers from Technics or Techniques, and they are called the SC-CX700, and the fabric that wraps each speaker is called Dynamica. Now, a fun fact here, Dynamica is made by Japanese company Asahi Kasei, and that's the same company that makes AKM DAC chips. Anyway, as usual, we're going to assess the Technics or Techniques using music we read about in the NME, in Rolling Stone magazine, and over at The Wire. And I'm going to tell you what I like about these speakers and what I don't like about them.
This episode is brought to you by AudioQuest. The cable company believes great audio performance begins with great power. Visit audioquest.com for more information.
Now, before we start, how about some indie rock from 2004. This is Interpol's Antics, and if you're new here, this is not an audiophile recording. I don't listen to audiophile recordings, I listen to music I actually like, and I would call this a dark and brooding art rock record that mainlines the ghost of Ian Curtis, and I absolutely bloody love it, although I don't bloody love it as much as its predecessor, Turn on the Bright Lights, which I think would get my vote as the most arresting debut album of all time. Disagree? I am sure you do. So hit us up in the comments with what you think is the most arresting debut of all time. Note I say most arresting, not best. Anyway, I've been listening to Antics via the Technics streaming speakers these past couple of months, both as a stream and this 20th anniversary edition, which is a red vinyl edition. Now, the SC-CX700, it's quite a mouthful, isn't it? I'll just call them Technics from now on. They put a 1.9 centimeter tweeter in the acoustic center of a 15 centimeter mid-bass driver. So they're a two-way. Now, that acoustic center alignment is called coaxial alignment sometimes, and it helps the speakers image more effectively, like draw a better focused soundstage, especially at close quarters. And that, I think, makes the Technics better suited to near-field listening, like on a desktop, than the smaller and more affordable PSB Alpha IQ, where the mid-bass driver and the tweeter are separated. Now, to test this and to confirm that the Technics are better imagers at closer quarters, I just pulled both pairs further into the room, so further forward from where you see them behind me now. And like the PSB, the Technics' primary speaker hands off the audio signal to the secondary speaker, either using a wireless connection or over an Ethernet wire. Now, back in lounge room mode, so basically with the speakers positioned where you see them now, the Technics draw a much larger soundstage than the PSB, and they sound altogether more transparent, just as we would expect from the size and price differential, because the Technics sell for €2,500 a pair and the PSB for €1,400 a pair. Now, I like the good dynamics that I hear from Warhouse's Time Bomb. Now, maybe that's because the MDMF Technics cabinet is internally divided into two chambers, and Technics calls this acoustic solitude construction. Now, the front chamber houses the drivers and the flared port, and the rear chamber houses the streaming board and the amplifiers. And those two chambers are separated by a wall, and also, and I think this is very important to Technics, an 8mm air gap. And this is done to prevent the driver's vibrations negatively impacting the electronics that sit behind them. Now, I also like the rhythmic attack I hear from M83's Run Into Flowers. And that could be because these speakers use digital amplifiers. So inside each speaker, we get watts for the mid-bass driver and 40 watts for the tweeter. Now, a digital amp means the signal stays in the digital domain from input to output with no interceding DAC stage. So it's not like a traditional Class D amp. Now, I think I just heard vinyl purists wince at the thought of their precious analog signal being digitized upon entry to the Technics primary loudspeaker. But I don't think the internal ADC takes away as much as the internal phono stage gives us. I hear nothing to complain about when listening to Interpol's Antics on a Rega Planar 8 fitted with an Autophon 2M Black. And in fact, I tried to insert an iPhono phono stage, a cheapy one, like a $150 one, between the Rega and the Technics speakers, so I had to use the line level input on the Technics speakers, and the sound wasn't as good. So I think Technics have done quite a good job of fitting a decent sounding phono stage inside their streaming active loudspeakers. Now back with streaming itself, I really like the clarity and the purity I hear on the suitably titled Beautiful Sound by Jack Ladder and the Dreamlanders. And that could be because Technics has put its JENO engine into each speaker. Now the JENO engine is designed to reduce a digital signal's jitter. Now that's important when the signal travels from input to amplifier output in the digital domain. Alternatively, that clarity and purity could be down to the tweeter's waveguide and its phase plug. Mind you, Technics' contact told me that the ring tweeter's lower weight permits faster rise times and faster fall times than a traditional dome tweeter, because inside this speaker there is something called the ring tweeter, and I'll put a link to more information on that in the show notes below. Let's move on to some things that I don't really like. So for example, the circular grills, right? They are magnetically attachable, and I think they're good for keeping, I guess, curious kids' fingers away from the drivers. But I don't think they do very much for the aesthetic appeal for these loudspeakers. You might disagree, I don't know, but that's the way I see it. And fully loaded, the Technics' primary speaker will yawn with HDMI, analog RCA, Toslink, USB-C, Ethernet to the router, and Ethernet to the secondary speaker. Now, not everybody's going to use these fully loaded, but even partially loaded, you've got a few sort of cables coming off the back. And I still think that's quite a lot of cable vomit to deal with. And I think that means you really need to put the Technics on speaker stands that have some kind of cable management built in. Mine do not. Then there is Technics' Audio Center Control app that wraps Qobuz, Amazon Music, Tidal and Deezer. Now, it's not as quick or as snappy as I would like in finding the speakers when you first start the app up. And its UI, it definitely favors function over form. It's not what I would call an elegant looking app. Now, fortunately for me and probably for you, these speakers also support Tidal Connect, Spotify Connect, Apple AirPlay 2 and Google Chromecast, but I mainly used the Roon Ready input. So I didn't really need to use the Technics app all that often. Now, right now, I've got my Roon library sitting on an 8TB SSD drive inside the Grim MU2 streaming DAC, which is over here. Now, interestingly, the Grim is proving to be faster with starting music after hitting play in the app than the Roon Nucleus and its internal SSD. Now, not only that, it's much faster in starting streams instigated by the Roon ARC app. So ARC effectively turns any Roon library into a private streaming service. Now, I sat in a cafe with a friend last week, and he had his Roon library on a Nucleus a few miles away from Lisbon, and mine obviously is back in Berlin, right, on the MU2. And yet my Roon ARC streams started much faster than his, and we repeated the experiment at least 10 times. And mine won out. And that's despite internet connections being faster in Portugal than in Germany. So I think it's the hardware in play and not the connection speed, because my internet connection speed here is kind of slow. Anyway, I would like to thank Roon for sponsoring this video. Now back to some things that I like about the Technics speakers. I like the physical controls found on the top of the primary loudspeaker, and they are a combination of touch sensitive and click buttons. But I really don't like the plastic top plate. It isn't really becoming of speakers selling for this kind of money, and it's not as stylish as the controls found on top of the Kef LS50 Wireless 2. Now, all you whatabouters need to pay attention to this next bit, because I do not have a pair of LS50 Wireless 2 to hand here to conduct a side-by-side comparison. So instead, I thought I would do something a little bit more interesting. So what I did was I added a Marantz Stereo 70S to the Kef Q Concerto Meta for a system with very similar functionality to the Technics. So that means streaming, Phono stage, and also HDMI ARC. And that teed up a side-by-side comparison between an active speaker system and a passive speaker system, where both systems sell for similar money. Now, next to the passive system, the Technics sounds cleaner in the mid-range. They have more of an exciting sort of lean forward kind of sound, whereas the Kef Marantz system gives us more of a sort of lean back kind of sound. Now, with the Technics, there's, I think, a greater emphasis on clarity and transparency, but less of an emphasis on low frequency, weight and push and heft. So I find myself wanting to add a subwoofer to the Technics when listening to Uncle's Rabbit in Your Headlights, that's with Tom York, but I don't have that urge when playing the same track through the Kef and the Marantz pairing. And yes, the primary Technics loudspeaker has a full range subwoofer output, right? So that means there is no bass management inside the speaker and inside the app. All the filtering for the subwoofer must be done on the sub itself. However, on soundstage size, and as evidenced by Talking Heads' Sugar on My Tongue, the 2024 remaster, the Technics play it much bigger in all directions. And I think they pull up alongside the more costly A500 from Buchardt, which is also a streaming active loudspeaker, right? And I think the Technics sound cleaner and clearer with movie dialogue than the Danes. So that's really another big like for me. And that's, I think, along with soundstage size, another one of the Technics' standout features. Really the ability to keep voices sounding crisp and clean when watching TV. Now, perhaps this is at least partially attributable to how Technics have engineered their HDMI ARC connection to be low noise. Now that's kind of complicated what they've done. It's a little bit boring. I don't want to weigh down this video with it, so I'll put a link to what they did in the show notes below. But, and here comes the but, right, is that the Technics, they sound sometimes a little too keen in the upper mids. Now, how you feel about that or what you think of that will depend on what kind of music you listen to. So for me, modern pop and electronic music like Björk and LCD sound system fare better than acoustic music. So for example, the acoustic guitar heard on Bright Eyes' what's it called? Is it At the Bottom of Everything? It's the first track on their 2004 album. And I've forgotten what it's called. It's the one that's not Digital Ash and Digital Urn. Anyway, that song, At the Bottom of Everything, the acoustic guitar can sound a little forced and a little unnatural at times. Well, not at times, actually always. But by contrast, the percussion heard on the Sabres of Paradise's Wilmot, I think enjoys more pep in Technics' hands. And they really light up the electric guitars on Sonic Youth's The Diamond Sea. I'm wide awake, it's morning. That's what that Bright Eyes album is called. So yeah, for me and my music tastes, I actually prefer the sound of the Technics in this passive versus active standoff. And I have to step the Kef up to the much more expensive Luxman L505Z integrated to invert that preference. Which brings us to what I like most about the SC-CX700. And that is, it's an all-in-one system in a box. And because the amplifiers are inside the speakers, it pulls us away from the which amplifier odyssey. I know some audiophiles like that, But not all audio or hi-fi people or people buying these kinds of systems think the same way. And on top of that, Technics has tuned the 2 digital amplifiers inside each speaker to each driver. Because remember, we get 1 amp per driver, and we don't get that with a passive system like the Kef and the Marantz. Anyway, if you like this video, please consider subscribing to this channel and hit us up on Patreon for exclusive behind the scenes footage and videos. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Oh, and one more thought. I probably will make a follow-up video to this one if there are enough good comments and questions spilling in the comment section below. We'll see.